Della Vance stood in her own father's kitchen and watched her stepmother feed his last words to the stove. The pages caught slow. Then, all at once. That morning, Cordelia had moved Della's things out to the bunkhouse and given her dead mother's room to a guest. Della did not cry. She had learned that a long time ago. You do not cry in front of a woman who is counting on it. Cordelia held the burning will up with the iron fire tongs, right there in front of Della, in front of the lawyer Speck, in front of 2 hired hands who would not meet her eyes. 4 people watching. Cordelia smiled the way a person smiles when they have already won and only want you to know it. Your father's wishes are ash now, she said. This is my land. You'll leave with what you can carry. Della looked at the fire. She thought about her father's hands, and she said, quiet as anything, Papa never trusted anything to a single sheet of paper. He did everything twice. Once for God, and once for the county. If you have ever been treated as invisible by your own family, this story is for you. Before we ride on, do one thing for me. Tap that subscribe button, and down in the comments, tell me the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story rides. Go on. I'll wait. Now, let me take you back. Because to understand what that fire meant, you have to understand the girl standing in front of it, and the man who raised her, and the ground they raised each other on. The rocking Fee sat in a fold of grass along Cordero Creek, out near Pinto Wells, in Kestrel County, Colorado Territory. It wasn't the biggest spread in the valley. It wasn't the prettiest. But every fence post in it had been set by a Vance hand, and every head of cattle wore a mark Josiah Vance had burned himself. Della was born in the low house by the creek. Her mother, Ruth, died when Della was 12. A fever came up one January and took her in 9 days, and after that, it was just the girl and her father and the wind. Some men would have sent the child off to an aunt. Josiah didn't. He put her up on a horse instead. He taught her to rope a running steer before she was 13. He taught her to read a brand at 50 yards, to doctor a bloated calf, to find the fence break by the way the cattle drifted. He taught her the ditch, too. The 2 of them dug the Cordero Creek ditch by hand, one summer, foot by foot, so the high meadow would drink even in a dry year. Water in that country was worth more than gold. Josiah knew it. He made sure his daughter knew it too, and he taught her the mark. She remembered the day the way you remember the good ones, all light and no clock. She was maybe 10. He set the branding iron in the coals and let it come up to heat, and he crouched down beside her with the calf snub tight, and he pressed the iron to the hide clean and quick. The smell of it, the hiss, the V, and the little rocker curve beneath it. Like a cradle. There, he said. Now girl, you listen. A brand and a deed. That's how you keep a thing in this world. One on the hide. One at the county. You hear me? A man's word is fine, but paper outlives the man, and the county keeps its own. He tapped her on the crown of her head with 2 fingers. Twice. Always twice. Once for God, and once for the county. She didn't understand it then. She thought it was just her father talking, the way he talked, in little sayings that meant nothing until they meant everything. She would understand it later. But not yet. Della grew up straight and strong and clear-eyed, and when she was old enough she went off to Denver, of all things, to teach school. She had a fine hand and a head for figures and a way with small children, and she took a schoolroom on the east side and thought maybe that would be her life. Chalk dust and a boarding room and the little bell. Then her father married again. Cordelia Price was a Denver widow 3 years back. She came to a church supper on the arm of a friend and turned her attention on Josiah Vance like a lamp turned on a book. She was maybe 40, handsome still, warm at the table, quick with a laugh. She brought her brother with her, a man named Harlan, who called himself a land broker and had soft hands and a hard eye. Josiah was 60 and alone and had been alone a long time. He never had a chance. Della didn't hate her for it. That's the thing you have to understand. Della was glad, at first. She wanted her father to have someone to sit across the table from in the evening. Cordelia was pleasant to her. Called her dear. Sent letters to Denver in a looping hand. It seemed fine. It seemed better than fine. Then, that last winter, the pneumonia came. It came the way it comes to old men in that country. A cough that wouldn't quit, then a fever, then the rattle in the chest that everybody in a ranching town knows the sound of. And when the word reached Della in Denver, she did not think twice. She packed a single bag. She gave up her schoolroom, the little bell, the whole life of it, and she got on the stage and went home. She nursed him for 11 weeks. She sat up nights with a basin of cool water and a cloth. She spooned broth into him when he could take it. She read to him when he couldn't. Cordelia was there too, at first, hovering in the doorway, wringing a handkerchief. But it was Della who did not sleep. It was Della who was holding his hand at the gray hour of a March morning when he squeezed once, and let go, and was gone. And here is the thing I want you to hold on to. In all those weeks, in all that nursing, Della never once asked her father what she would get. Not once. She never asked about the will. She never asked about the land. She would have been ashamed to. She sat with him because he was her father, and she loved him. And that was the whole of it. She figured fairness would sort itself out. She figured a thing that true didn't need to be forced. That was her mistake. Not a sin, just a mistake. She believed that being right would be enough. She believed the world would see what was fair and do it, without her having to stand up and make it. The world does not work that way. She was about to learn how it does. They buried Josiah Vance on a rise above the creek, next to Ruth, under a cottonwood that had been a sapling when the two of them married. Half the county came. Men she'd known all her life took off their hats and pressed her hand and said he was a good man. The best of them, they didn't make them like that anymore. Old Tom Ainsley, who'd ridden for the Rocking V for 20 years, stood at the back with his hat over his heart and tears running plain down his weathered face, and didn't bother to hide a one of them. Cordelia wore black and wept prettily, and accepted the county's sympathy like a queen accepting tribute. And the very week they laid him in the ground, before the flowers had gone brown, it began. Della came in from the barn one evening to find her things gone from her room. Her room. The room she'd slept in her whole life. Her clothes, her books, her mother's photograph in its little tin frame, all of it carried out. She found them in the bunkhouse, dumped on a bare rope cot among the smell of old leather and horse and men. Her trunk sat in the dirt by the door. She went back to the house. Cordelia was in the front room, arranging things. "There's been a mistake," Della said. "My things are out in the bunkhouse." "Oh, that's no mistake, dear." Cordelia didn't even turn around. "We've a guest coming Thursday. Mr. Harlan's associate. I've given him the front bedroom. It's the nicest, and one must put one's guests at ease." She smoothed a doily. "The bunkhouse is perfectly comfortable. Your father slept rougher than that half his life, I'm sure." Della stood very still. "The front bedroom was my mother's room." Now Cordelia turned. And she smiled, and there was nothing behind the smile at all. "Your mother," she said gently, "has been dead a great many years." That night, at supper, Della sat at her own father's table and was served last. Cordelia served Harlan first, then the guest, then herself, and by the time the plate reached Della, the good of the meal was gone and the gravy had skinned over. Nobody said anything about it. That was the cruelty of it. It was done smoothly, like it was natural, like it was the order of things, and always had been. A stranger sitting at that table would never have known that the girl served last had been born in the house. Della ate what was on her plate. She said thank you. And inside, something that had been soft began, very quietly, to go hard. I want you to notice how it was done. Not with a raised hand, not with a shout, with a doily and a supper plate. That's how they do it to the ones they mean to erase. Small, deniable, so small that if you complain, you're the one making trouble over nothing. Have you known a person like that? Someone who could cut you to the bone with a smile and a soft word, and leave you standing there feeling foolish for bleeding? Tell me in the comments. I think a lot of you have. It was a few days after that Della found the tin box. Her father kept his papers in an old tobacco tin on a high shelf in the office off the front room. With Della moved to the bunkhouse and Cordelia queen of the house, Della hadn't wanted to go in there, but she wanted her mother's photograph, which had gone missing again, and she thought maybe it had been set on the shelf, and so one afternoon when Cordelia and Harlan had ridden into Pinto Wells, Della slipped into the office and took the tin box down. It was full of the leavings of a careful man's life. The bill of sale on the first 100 head. A receipt for the ditch survey. A folded letter from Ruth, dated before they were married, that Della could not bring herself to read. And down at the bottom, a slip of paper she almost passed over. A land office receipt. Stamped and dated, 3 years back, near enough to the week her father married Cordelia. From the recorder's office at Alder Springs, and holding that slip of paper, she heard her father's voice, plain as if he stood behind her. He'd said it not long after the wedding. She'd been home for a visit. He'd come in dusty from a 2-day ride he wouldn't explain, and when she'd asked where he'd been, he'd only smiled and said he'd carried a copy of something down to the land office. "Paper burns, girl," he'd said, hanging up his hat. "But the county keeps its own." She'd thought nothing of it at the time. She thought it now for about the length of a breath. Then, she heard a wagon in the yard, and she put the tin box back on its shelf, and she slid the receipt in among the others, and forgot it. Remember that receipt. Della didn't. But you do. The second blow landed on a bright cold morning about a week on. Della kept a horse, a sorrel gelding named Copper, 3 years old, sweet-tempered and quick, that her father had given her the last summer of his health. "Every hand needs one horse that's theirs and nobody else's," he'd said, putting the lead rope in her hand. "This one's yours, girl. Papers and all." He'd meant it as a joke, the papers part. But he'd meant the horse. That morning she came out to the barn, and Copper's stall was empty. She found Tom Ainsley in the alley, and Tom would not look at her. He was an old man, bolligged, honest to the last inch, and he stood there turning his hat in his hands like it might come apart. "Where's Copper, Tom?" "Sold, Miss Della." He said it low. "Man come at first light. Mrs. Vance had it all arranged. And Miss," he stopped, started again. "She let me go. 20 years I rode for your daddy. She says the new outfit won't be needing so many hands once things are settled. Told me to clear my things by noon." Della felt the blood go out of her face. Copper and Tom, who had put her up on her first pony, who had taught her to whistle, who had carried her on his shoulders through a river once when she was small and terrified. Both gone in one morning, wiped off the place like chalk off a slate. She looked toward the house. Cordelia stood on the porch, watching, just watching, with her arms folded to see what Della would do. Della did nothing. She had learned by then that giving that woman a reaction was giving her a gift. So she turned to Tom instead, and she took his rough old hand in both of hers, and she said, "You come find me in town, Tom Ainsley. This isn't finished. You hear me? This isn't finished." The old man looked at her a long moment, then something in his face changed. He straightened up a little, and he did a thing he had not done since she was a child. He touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat and dipped his head to her, the way a cowhand does to the owner of the outfit. To the boss. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I hear you." And he rode out with his life in a war bag behind his saddle, and he did not look back at Cordelia once. 2 witnesses now, if you're counting. First it was done in private, girl and stepmother. Then Tom saw the horse sold and the old man let go. The circle was widening. Cordelia was getting bolder, and boldness, when you're doing wrong, is a kind of blindness. It was about to make her do something in front of a whole room full of eyes, because here is what Cordelia did not know, and what Harlan did not know, and what the lawyer Speck was counting on nobody ever finding out. There were 2 wills. Josiah Vance had written a will. A true one, in his own careful hand, leaving the rocking V to his daughter, Della, with a decent life provision for the wife he'd married late. A home and a keep for as long as she deals honestly with my girl. That was the true will. That was the one he'd read to no one, but had told Della existed. That was the one he'd carried a copy of down to Alder Springs the week he married Cordelia. Because he was a careful man, and he'd known, the way careful men know, that a warm woman at a church supper is not always a warm woman at a graveside. And there was a second will. A forged one. Written after his death by a hand that was not his, witnessed by names that would not bear looking into, leaving the whole of the rocking fee to Cordelia Vance, free and clear. Speck had it in his bag. Speck, the family lawyer who had grown fond of being paid and was not fond of hard questions. Speck, who assumed, as men like Speck always assume, that no one would ever think to check the county. The reading was held in the parlor a fortnight after the funeral. They made an occasion of it. Cordelia in her black. Harlan by the window with his thumbs in his vest. Speck at the head of the table with his spectacles and his bag. 2 of the hired hands standing back by the wall, called in to witness, shifting their weight, not sure why they were there. And Della, brought in like a guest in her own house and given a chair at the far end. Speck cleared his throat and read. It didn't take long. The rocking fee ranch, its lands, its water, its stock, and all its appurtenances, to Cordelia Vance, absolutely. There was no mention of Della at all. Not a horse, not a keepsake, not a line, as if she had never been born. For a moment the room was silent. The 2 hands looked at their boots. Then Della stood up. That is not my father's will. Speck looked at her over his spectacles. I assure you, Miss Vance, it is properly, that is not his hand. Her voice was steady. She walked to the table and put her finger on the page. My father made his 7s with a bar across the middle. Look, there's no bar. And he never in his life spelled appurtenances, he'd have said, and everything on it. This isn't him. Somebody wrote this. The room went very cold. Harlan pushed off the window. Cordelia's face did a thing, just for an instant. A flicker, quick as a snake in grass, and then went smooth again. Grief, Cordelia said softly to the room, makes people say hard things. I'll forgive her. She loved him. She turned her wet, patient eyes on Della. Dear, the will is the will. Mister, Speck has seen 100 of them. Don't make this uglier than it has to be. But Della had said it out loud now, in front of witnesses, and that was a problem. That was a loose thread. And Cordelia Price was not a woman who left threads, so that night she cut it. It was late. The hands were still up, and Speck was staying the night before his ride back, and Della had come into the kitchen for a cup of water before going out to her cot in the bunkhouse. And Cordelia was there, at the stove, with a sheaf of papers in her hand, and the fire door open, and the fire tongs in her fist. Della saw it and understood it all at once. Because these were not the papers Speck had read from. These were older, softer, folded, and unfolded 100 times. This was covered in a careful hand that made its 7s with a bar across the middle. That's his, Della said. That's the real one. You kept it, I kept it, Cordelia agreed, pleasant as pie, in case I ever needed to be sure of what it said. She called out, not loudly, and Speck came in, and the 2 hands drifted in behind him, drawn by the something in the air. 4 of them now, watching, exactly the way Cordelia wanted it. She was not hiding this. She was teaching a lesson, and she wanted an audience for the teaching. She held the true will up in the fire tongs. She let Della look at it one last second. Her father's hand. Her father's sevens. Then she fed it to the stove. "Your father's wishes are ash now," Cordelia said, over the small, bright sound of the paper catching. "This is my land. You'll leave with what you can carry." And that is where we came in. That is the fire you saw at the start. Now you know the girl standing in front of it. Now you know it was the second will she watched burn, the real one, the one in his own hand, while the forged one sat safe in a lawyer's bag. The two hands looked sick. One of them, a young fellow named Pettit, actually opened his mouth like he might say something. Cordelia's eyes went to him, and he shut it and looked away. That's how it works. That's how the wrong of the world gets done in the open, not because good men aren't watching, but because they're afraid, and the cruel ones know it, and count on it. Della watched the last of it curl and blacken, and she felt the strangest thing, not despair. She had braced for despair. Instead, down under the grief, she felt her father's two fingers tap the crown of her head. Twice. Always twice. Once for God, and once for the county. She did not say it out loud. She had learned that much. She simply said, quiet. So quiet that Papa never trusted anything to a single sheet of paper. And Cordelia, who was already turning away, victorious, did not hear it or did not care. She should have cared. But we'll get to that. Della left the rocking fee the next morning with what she could carry. One trunk. One bag. Her mother's photograph, which she had found at last, face down in a drawer. She rode into Pinto Wells on a borrowed wagon and took a room at Mrs. Delphine Boone's boarding house on the main street, a clean, narrow room with a window that looked out on the mountains. And she sat on the edge of the bed and let herself for about 10 minutes feel the full weight of it. Then she got up and started to work. Mrs. Boone was a widow of 60 with iron-gray hair and a way of knowing everybody's business without ever seeming to ask. Over supper the first night, without prying, she managed to draw the whole story out of Della. And when it was done, she set down her fork and said, "Josiah Vance's girl put out to a boarding house 3 weeks after we buried him." Well, she folded her hands. That woman has made a mistake. She's made this a story people will tell. And people in this valley don't forget a story. It was Mrs. Boone and Tom Ainsley who did come find her in town, just like she'd told him to, who filled in the rest of the picture. Because there was a reason for the hurry. There is always a reason for the hurry. Harlan Price, Cordelia's brother, the soft-handed land broker, had not come to Colorado for his health. He had brokered a sale. $6,000, cash for the whole rocking V, from a Denver outfit called the Front Range Land and Cattle Company. And it wasn't the grass they wanted, or the house, or the stock. It was the water. The Cordero Creek water rights. The ditch that Della and her father had dug by hand, foot by foot, one hot summer. Front Range had a man named Renfro in the valley, quietly buying up creek rights, and Josiah's was the last piece he needed. And with it the company would control every drop that ran down that side of the county. $6,000. Cordelia would clear Josiah's note. He'd borrowed $2,400 against next year's cattle at the Cattlemen's Trust, the way ranchers do, and pocket the rest, and Harlan would take his broker's cut, and it would all be recorded clean and legal at the land office in 21 days. 21 days from the reading. After that, the title would be Front Ranges, and no widow's daughter's protest would be worth the breath to make it. That was the clock. That was why Della's things went to the bunkhouse before the flowers wilted. Cordelia didn't hate Della, particularly. Cordelia just needed her gone, quiet and quick, before anyone looked too hard at a will written in the wrong hand. A grieving girl making noise in town was a risk. A grieving girl gone off to Denver, signed and settled, was safe. Which is why, on the 4th day, Cordelia came to town herself. She came to the boarding house in her good dress and her patient smile and sat down across from Della in Mrs. Boone's front parlor as if she were paying a social call. She had a paper with her. Of course she did. "I've been unfair to you," Cordelia said. "Grief does things to a household. I want to make it right." She slid the paper across. "This is a quitclaim. You give up any claim you might imagine you have, and dear, I know you imagine you have one, and in return, I'll give you $200 cash in your hand today. Enough to get you back to Denver and set up again. A fresh start." The smile. "Take the money, dear. Go teach your little children. Let the ranching to those who understand it. There's nothing here for you now but hard feelings. $200. For the rocking V. For the ditch. For her father's grave and her mother's grave and every fence post a Vance hand had ever set. $200 to sign her name and disappear. And here is where the girl who believed fairness would sort itself out, the girl who never asked what she'd inherit, finally understood that no one was coming to sort it for her, that if it was going to be made right, she was going to have to make it right. Herself, with her own 2 hands, the way her father dug a ditch. She did not let a bit of it show. She looked down at the paper a long moment, and when she looked up her eyes were wet and her voice was small and beaten, and she said, "It's a great deal to think about. My whole life's here." She swallowed. "Give me a day, just one day to make my peace with it. Then I'll sign." Cordelia's smile spread wide and easy. She thought she knew exactly what she was looking at. A broken girl, coming around to sense. "Of course, dear," she said, rising, gathering her gloves. "One day. Take your day." She patted Della's cheek on the way out, and Della let her. The moment the door closed, Della's tears stopped like a tap shut off because she had remembered the receipt. Sitting there with that quitclaim in front of her, her father's voice had come back a 3rd time, and this time she truly heard it. "Paper burns, girl, but the county keeps its own." Twice. Always twice. He'd carried a copy down to the land office the week he married Cordelia. Not because he was strange, because he was careful, and because some part of him had taken the measure of the warm woman from the church supper, and had wanted, quietly, to be sure his girl was safe no matter what. He had done everything twice. Cordelia had burned one. But she had only burned one. The next morning before light, Della Vance saddled a rented horse and rode east, out of Pinto Wells, up the long grade toward Alder Springs, where the county land office sat. She told no one where she was going. Not Tom. Not Mrs. Boone. She rode all morning with the receipt tucked in her glove, and she got to the land office as the recorder was unlocking the door. His name was Amos Crane. He was a spare, tidy, unhurried man, a county recorder to the bone, the kind who believed that the whole civilization rested on things being written down correctly and kept in the right box. Della gave him the receipt. She gave him the date. She asked him, with her heart going hard against her ribs, whether her father, Josiah Vance of the Rocking Fifth, had filed anything with his office 3 years back, near the week of his marriage. Amos Crane looked at the receipt. He looked at her over it, the way careful men look, taking her measure. Then he went to the back, to the great iron safe that stood against the wall, and he was gone a long few minutes, and Della stood at the counter not daring to breathe. He came back with a folded document, sealed, ribboned, and stamped with the county's own stamp. A certified duplicate, Amos Crane said, of the last will and testament of Josiah Vance, filed by his own hand with a sworn statement on the date you named. It's been sitting in that safe ever since. He set it on the counter between them, but kept his hand flat on top of it. "Now, before I say another word, young lady, you'd best tell me what's happened out at the Rocking V, because I have heard a rumor or two this week that doesn't sit square with a will that reads the way this one reads." Della looked at the sealed paper under the recorder's careful hand. Her father's foresight, 3 years in an iron box, waiting. She had ridden in that morning with nothing but a receipt and a hunch, and here it was. Real, filed, certified, the one thing in the world that could not be burned, because it had never been in that kitchen to burn. Cordelia had fed the copy to the stove and thought she'd fed the truth to the stove. She had crowed it in front of 4 witnesses. Your father's wishes are ash now, and the whole time, the true will, his own hand, his barred sevens, his daughter's name, had been sitting sealed in the county's safe, not a 2-hour ride away, keeping its own quiet company in the dark. Della put her hand flat on the counter next to the recorders, not to take the paper, not yet. And she looked Amos Crane in the eye, and she began, for the first time since the funeral, to tell the whole of it, from the bunkhouse to the burning. But knowing the copy existed was one thing. She had a day promised to Cordelia, a quitclaim waiting for her name, a $6,000 sale grinding toward the recorder's counter, and only 21 days on the clock. Finding the truth and making it stand up in the open, in front of the right people. Before the wrong ones could bury it a second time, that was going to take more than a certified duplicate in an iron box. It was going to take a trap. And Della Vance, standing at that counter with her dead father's foresight under her hand, was just beginning to see the shape of the one she'd build. Amos Crane listened to the whole of it without once taking his hand off the paper. The bunkhouse, the horse, the stove. The 4 sets of eyes. When she finished, he was quiet a long moment, the way a man is quiet when he has decided something and is only waiting for his mouth to catch up. "There's a thing you can do," he said. "It's called a caveat. It means you stand up at the county's counter and say, before God and the docket, that a sale is in dispute. Once it's filed, I can't record a clean transfer on that land until the contest is heard. Then file it," Della said. "There's more." He tapped the sealed will. "You could march this out to Pinto Wells today. Wave it in her face in Mrs. Boone's parlor. And she'd call it a fake, and Speck would back her, and it'd be your word against theirs, in a room they own." He let that sit. Or, you let them come here. To recording day. To the one place they can't argue with. You let them walk right up to the safe that's already beaten them, and you let me open it in front of the buyer and the banker and half the county. Paper doesn't shout, Miss Vance. But it doesn't blink, either. Della thought of her father. Once for God, once for the county. He had known. 3 years ago, the week he married that woman, he had ridden down here and handed the truth to a stranger in an iron box, because he trusted the county more than he trusted his own kitchen. "File the caveat," she said, "and hold the record. Produce the will on the day, in the open. Not a word before." "Not a word," Crane agreed. He drew a fresh sheet toward him and dipped his pen. "You understand what this costs you. You have to go back and wear the loss on your face. You have to let her believe she won." "I've been letting her believe that since the funeral," Della said. "I can do it 3 weeks more." So she signed. The caveat went onto the docket in Crane's tidy hand, and the certified duplicate went back into the dark of the safe, and Della rode home to Pinto Wells with a courthouse receipt folded small in her coat and defeat arranged carefully across her mouth. Mrs. Boone met her on the boarding house steps. The widow was 60 and missed nothing, and she looked at Della the way a doctor looks at a wound. "You've been somewhere," she said. "Alder Springs." "For my mother's death record. A girl ought to have it." The lie came out smooth, and Della hated how easily it came. "I'm going to sign the woman's paper, Mrs. Boone. There's no use fighting money." Mrs. Boone's eyes narrowed a hair. Then, slow, she nodded, and Della understood that the widow had decided to help her lie. whatever the lie was for. "Come in," she said. "I've got beans and I've got questions, and you'll answer the ones I judge you can." The next morning, Harlan Price nearly ruined all of it. Della had ridden to the county clerk's little window at the far end of the same building, a separate errand, a real one, the certified copy of Ruth Vance's death that she'd used for her cover story. She was folding it into her glove when a soft-handed shadow fell across the counter. Well now. Harlan, his good coat, his oiled hair, his smile that never reached above his cheekbones, didn't take you for the courthouse type, Miss Vance. Della's stomach dropped clean to her boots. Behind that window, not 30 feet off, sat the docket with her caveat inked plain on it. If he leaned. If he asked the clerk one wrong question. She did not let her face move. "My mother's death record," she said, and held it up. The real thing, the county seal pressed into the corner. 12 years I never had it. Seemed a poor daughter that couldn't say the day her own mother died. She let her voice go thin. "I wanted one paper in this world with my family's name on it that your sister couldn't take. That did it." That was exactly the shape of grief Harlan expected from a beaten girl. His smile eased into something almost like pity. The pity of a man counting his commission. "Sentiment," he said. "There's no money in it, but I understand the pull." He touched his hat. "Cordelia says you're coming round to sense. Sign the settlement, take your 200, and there's no reason we can't part friendly." He drifted off toward the land office proper, toward the counter where, in 12 days, everything he owned would come apart. Della waited until he was through the door. Then, she leaned on the wall and breathed. Cycle 2 came in her own room, and it was worse, because there was no window between her and the danger. She'd been careless. She'd left the Alder Springs caveat receipt in her coat instead of Mrs. Boone's strongbox, and Cordelia had come to the boarding house to press the settlement in person. And while Della fetched water, her stepmother had gone through the coat on the peg with a thief's easy hands. Della came back to find Cordelia holding the slip up to the light. "Alder Springs," Cordelia read. "The land office." Now, what would a girl who's signing away her land want at the land office? The room went very still. Downstairs, Mrs. Boone's kettle ticked. Della looked at the paper in that gloved hand, the same hand that had held the fire tongs, and she made herself small and tired and broke. "It's the boarding debt," she said. "Mrs. Boone carried me 11 weeks. I asked the county what a lien costs, whether she could put one on me. I owe her, and I've got nothing." She let her chin drop. "You've seen to that." Cordelia studied her a long, cold moment. She was a clever woman. She was certain paper was the whole of truth, and here was a paper, and it said what a broke girl's paper ought to say. She let it fall back into the coat. "Sign my settlement Thursday," she said, "and pay your widow, and go teach schoolchildren somewhere far from my creek." She drew on her other glove. "I did try to be kind to you, Della. You'll remember that. In time, I gave you every chance to leave with your dignity." "I'll remember," Della said, and meant it in a way Cordelia would not understand for 12 more days. The third cycle she only heard about, second hand, and it was the one that told her the trap was biting. Mrs. Boone brought it home from the mercantile like a cat brings a bird. The recorder up at Alder Springs, she said, had gone slow on the rocking V transfer. Some question of the docket. Some paper out of order. Renfro, the front range man, had been seen twice in 3 days riding the road between the ranch and the county seat, and he was not a patient sort. He wanted his water rights recorded, and he wanted them clean, and a delay to a man like that smelled like a lawsuit waiting to hatch. "And your stepmother, Mrs., Boone said, ladling beans, has got the lawyer spec up there leaning on the recorder to hurry it." Which a lawyer can't do, but a lawyer can bluster. She set the ladle down. "Girl, I have kept your lie for you without knowing its shape. I'll ask you once plain. Is there a thing coming that I ought to be in that room to see?" Della looked at the widow who had carried her 11 weeks on faith. "Recording day," she said. "At the land office. The 20th. Be there. Bring anyone in Pinto Wells who ever thought my father was an honest man." Mrs. Boone smiled, slow, and it was not a kind smile at all. It was the smile of a woman of 60 who had been waiting her whole life to watch the proud fall. "I'll bring a wagon full," she said. The 20th came up cold and bright, the aspens gone to gold along the Alder Springs Road. Della rode in behind Mrs. Boone's wagon, and the wagon was full, just as promised, the blacksmith, the storekeeper, 2 of the churchwomen, old Pettit the hired hand who'd watched the burning and never forgiven himself the silence. Tom Ainsley was there too, hat in his hands, 20 years of rocking fee dust on his boots, and a look on his face like a man come to a hanging he'd paid to see. The land office was a low stone building with a single long counter, and behind the counter, in the wall, the iron safe. Amos Crane stood at the counter in a clean collar with his account books squared and his key on a chain. He nodded to Della once, small, and went back to being the tidiest man in the territory. Cordelia arrived in a hired rig with Harlan beside her and Speck trailing, his bag under his arm. Renfro was already there, and with him a spare gray gentleman from the Cattlemen's Trust who kept a bank draft in his breast pocket and checked his watch like a man who charged by the minute. Cordelia saw the crowd and paused on the threshold. Her eyes went over the townsfolk, over Tom, over Mrs. Boone planted in the front like a fence post. Something crossed her face. Not fear. Not yet. Just the faint annoyance of a woman who'd expected a private transaction and found an audience. "What's all this?" she said. "Recording's public business," Crane said mildly. "Always has been. Anyone may stand and watch the county keep its books." He drew the deed toward him. "Now, we've a transfer of the Rocking V, Front Range land and cattle the grantee, $6,000 the consideration. Before I record, I read what's on the docket. That's the law and I don't skip it. There's nothing on the docket," Speck said quickly. "Record the deed." Crane wet his thumb and turned the big page around so it faced them. "There's this." Harlan leaned in. Della watched his soft face read the word, watched it go the color of tallow. "Caveat," he said. "Cordelia, there's a caveat filed. By whom?" Cordelia's voice had lost its silk. "By me," Della said. The room turned. She had stayed by the door in her plain coat, invisible the way she'd been invisible for 11 weeks, and now she stepped forward to the counter, and she was not invisible at all. "You signed nothing," Cordelia said. "Thursday you were to sign. I let you think I would." Della's voice was even. She had practiced being calm so long it had become real. "You had to believe you'd won, or you'd never have walked into this room." Speck recovered first. He set his bag on the counter and drew himself up. "This caveat's a nuisance filing. The girl has no standing. She's a disinherited party under a probated will. Mr. Crane, move to strike it for want of standing and record the deed. I'll indemnify the county myself." For a heartbeat it hung there. Renfro's man took out his bank draft. Cordelia lifted the pen. The whole thing tipped toward the edge, toward clean title recorded and the truth buried a second time under $6,000 and a lawyer's word. "Before you strike anything," Crane said, "the caveat requests one act of this office. It asks me to produce a certain instrument held in the county's care and read it into the record. And that instrument bears on standing." He hung the keychain off his finger. "So I'll produce it. Then you may argue about standing all you like." "What instrument?" Cordelia said. Crane crossed to the iron safe. The room went so quiet, Della could hear the meltwater in Cordero Creek 2 counties off in her memory. The key turned. The door swung on its heavy hinge, and from the dark of it Amos Crane drew a single sealed packet, ribboned and stamped, and laid it on the counter under the lamp. The last will and testament of Josiah Vance, he read from the endorsement, filed with this office for safekeeping. The certified duplicate of the original, deposited the 14th day of, he named the month, 3 years back. In his own hand. Sealed by me. Never opened since. He looked up over his spectacles. Which is a week, near as I can figure, after he married you, Mrs. Vance. Nobody breathed. That's not, Cordelia started. The will was probated. Speck holds the will. Speck holds a will, Crane said. He broke the county seal with his thumbnail, slow, deliberate, and unfolded the pages. Josiah Vance filed his with me. Shall I read it, or shall we pretend the county's safe is empty? Read it, said Mrs. Boone, from the front, and half the town said it with her. Crane read it. He read it plain and slow, in the flat voice of a man reading a deed, which was the only voice that could have carried the weight of it. He read that the rocking V Ranch, all its stock and land, and the water of Cordero Creek, went to Josiah's daughter, Della Vance, entire. He read the line about Josiah's wife, Cordelia, a home on the place, and a provision for her life, comfortable, generous even. And then he read the last of it, the part Della had not known was there, the part her father had put in with his own bard 3 years before he needed it. So long, Crane read, as she deals honestly with my girl. If she does not, she takes nothing under this will, and the whole of it is Della's, and the county may witness that I knew my own household well enough to write this down. The lamp hissed. Somewhere in the crowd, one of the churchwomen let out a small sound. Della stepped up to the counter and stood beside her father's will, and she looked at Cordelia across it, and when she spoke her voice was quiet, and it carried to every corner of that stone room. You didn't burn his will, she said. You burned the copy he handed you to keep the peace, the one he set in your keeping so you'd feel trusted. She let it land. His own has been sitting in the county's iron safe since the week he married you. He always did know which of us to trust. Once for God. Cordelia. Once for the county. Cordelia's gloved hand, poised over the unsigned deed, went still. It did not tremble. That was the terrible thing about her. Even now, it simply stopped, like a clock run down, and stayed stopped. The falls came one after another, and Della watched each one and did not gloat, because her father had not raised her to gloat. The county attorney had come in behind the town crowd, a sober man in spectacles, and he stepped to the counter now and put 2 papers side by side under the lamp, the will Speck had probated and the will from the safe. He did not need long. Josiah's hand was in the safe's copy, the barred 7s, the hard slant. The probated will was a fair copy in another hand entirely. The signature traced heavy, where a forger presses to be sure. This is not the same hand, the attorney said. And this, he touched the honest dealing clause, this you triggered yourself, Mrs. Vance, the night you burned a will in front of 4 witnesses and called a certified duplicate ash. You dealt dishonestly with his girl in front of the county's own hired man. He straightened. You take nothing, not the provision, not the home, not the $6,000, nothing, and there'll be a charge to answer for the probate of a forged instrument. Cordelia looked at the pen in her hand as if she'd forgotten what it was for. Harlan, she said, without turning. Harlan. Tell them. But Harlan was already gone. Della had watched him go. Watched the soft-handed broker do the arithmetic the instant Crane's key turned. Watched him understand that a caveat meant no clean title meant no sale meant no commission, and no commission meant that the advance he'd already borrowed and already spent had just come due with nothing to pay it. He'd slid along the wall to the side door while Crane was still reading, and by the time his sister said his name he was on his horse in the cold bright morning, riding out ahead of his own creditors, and no one in that room ever saw him in Kestrel County again. The gray man from the Cattleman's Trust folded his bank draft back into his breast pocket with the calm of a man who has just been saved from a bad loan. Renfro, the Front Range agent, was not so calm. "I contracted for water rights," he said. "Cordero Creek. I've got money in this." "You contracted with a woman who never owned the water," the county attorney said. "The creek's Della Vance's, and has been since her father died. There's no deal here to record. There never was one to make." Renfro looked at Della. For a moment she thought he might argue, might bluster the way his kind bluster. Then he read the room, the town at his back, the will on the counter, the attorney at his elbow, and he put on his hat. "Miss Vance," he said, and there was even a scrap of respect in it, the respect of a hungry man for a fence he can't climb. "If you ever want to sell your water honest, Front Range pays fair. Front Range can water its stock somewhere it's welcome," Della said. He tipped his hat and walked out into the cold, and the door swung shut behind him, and the buyer was gone. That left Speck. The lawyer had not moved from the counter. He stood with his bag still open, the forged will in the attorney's hands now, and Della watched the certainty drain out of him the way water drains out of a cracked trough, slow, then all at once. He had assumed 3 years ago that no one checks the county. He had built the whole fraud on that one assumption, and the county had been sitting there the entire time with the truth in an iron box. Elias Speck. The county attorney said his name the way you'd read a charge, and Speck flinched at his own name. "This is your hand on the tracing. You drew a false will, and you carried it to probate, and you swore to it. That's forgery, and it's fraud on this court. And it's the end of you at the bar in Kestrel County." He nodded to the door, where a deputy had come to stand. "You'll not leave the county until you've answered for it. Surrender your certificate." Speck sat down. Slowly, the way a much older man sits, he lowered himself onto the bench along the wall, and he set his bag on his knees, and he stared at the floor of the land office as if the answer to 20 years of practice were written in the stone. His hands lay open on the bag. He did not argue. There was nothing left to argue with. The county keeps its own. Della crossed to him. The room watched. She did not raise her voice. "You should have checked the county," she said. That was all. It was not cruel. It was just true. The truest thing that could be said to a man who had staked everything on the county's silence and lost. Speck did not look up. She turned last to Cordelia. Her stepmother stood alone at the counter now. Brother fled, buyer gone, banker's draft pocketed, lawyer broken on the bench. The unsigned deed lay in front of her, worth nothing. The will from the safe lay beside it, worth everything. 3 years married, 1 ranch coveted, 1 will burned, and here at the end of it, Cordelia Vance Price had exactly what her own arrogance had earned her, which was to say, precisely nothing. Della looked at the woman who had moved her mother's photograph face down in a drawer, who had put a guest in her mother's room and served her last at her own table, who had held the fire tongs and crowed your father's wishes are ash now in front of 4 sets of eyes. "You may take what you can carry," Della said. The same words. Turned around, Cordelia's own sentence handed back to her across the counter, without heat, without triumph, just the flat justice of it. And Cordelia heard her own voice in it, and something finally moved in that still face. Not tears. She was too proud for tears. Just a small tightening. The look of a woman who has understood, one day too late, that she never held anything at all. She set the pen down. She drew her gloves straight. And she walked out of the Alder Springs land office into the gold morning with what she could carry, which was a hired rig and a Denver address, and the knowledge that a dead man had outthought her from inside an iron box. The town let her pass. Nobody said a word. Mrs. Boone watched her go with the satisfaction of 60 years, and old Tom Ainsley turned his hat in his hands, and Amos Crane, tidiest man in the territory, squared the will on the counter and reached for his pen. "Miss Vance," he said. "Shall I enter you as owner in fee?" "You shall," Della said. And in the same hour, While the ink was still wet on her ownership, the gray man from the Cattlemen's Trust came back to the counter, not to buy, but to deal. Josiah's note at the trust, the $2,400, still stood against the land. But the land was hers now, clean, worth far more than the note, and a bank would rather have a solvent rancher paying honest interest than a lawsuit. "We can renegotiate the note, Miss Vance," he said. "New terms. You've got water, and you've got stock, and you've got the only clean title in this room. That's a customer worth keeping." "Then keep me fair," Della said, "the way you'd have kept my father," and they shook on it over the very counter where the false sale had died. She rode home to the rocking fee that evening the long way, along Cordero Creek, so she could hear it. The water her father had dug for by hand, the water 3 men had tried to sell out from under her, ran loud and cold and entirely her own in the last of the light. A year on, the ditch ran full again with spring melt. Dawn came up over the rocking fee soft and gold, the way it does in that country, and Della Vance stood on her own porch with a cup of coffee steaming into the cold and listened to Cordero Creek loud with snowmelt down in the meadow. Calves bawled in the near pen. The chokecherry by the kitchen was just going to bud. Tom Ainsley was at the branding fire in the yard, 20 years of foreman come back to him, and a good deal more spring in his step than a man his age had any right to, working the coals with a long iron. Inside, at the kitchen table, Mrs. Delphine Boone sat with her tea and a pan of biscuits, having decided some months back that a widow of 60 was wasted keeping a boarding house when there was a young rancher who needed feeding and minding, and Della had not argued, because she'd learned there was no point arguing with either of them. Her mother's photograph stood up right now on the mantel in its tin frame, dusted, facing the room. Ruth Vance's quilt was back on the bed in the true bedroom, the one with the good morning light, where it belonged. And the guest room was just a room again. Tom lifted the iron from the coals and looked it over and brought it to her, glowing, the rocking V mark clean on the end of it. The same mark her father had taught her to set when she was small enough to need lifting to see over the chute. A brand and a deed, girl, one on the hide, one at the county. She'd carried the second half of that all her life without understanding it. She understood it now. Della took the iron. She went to the pen where the first calf of the season stood waiting, and she set the rocking V on its hide herself, quick and clean, the way Josiah had shown her, and the calf kicked and bawled and trotted off to its mother none the worse, wearing her father's mark and her mother's ranch and the whole weight of a family that had kept its own. She was straightening from that, the iron cooling in her hand, when Mrs. Boone came out onto the porch with a letter. "Came up from Pinto Wells with the mail rider," the widow said. "Denver postmark. You know the hand." Della did. She'd have known it anywhere. She set the iron in the dirt to cool and opened the letter with a thumb and read it standing in the yard with the branding smoke drifting past. It was short. Cordelia's pride had cost her the ranch and the note and the sale, and the year since had cost her whatever was left. She wrote from a rooming house in Denver. She asked, in the careful words of a proud woman brought low, whether there might be at the rocking V a small place to land, a room, some small corner, for the widow of the man who'd built it. Della read it twice. Then she went inside and sat at her father's desk. In the office off the front room where the tobacco tin still sat on its high shelf, and she took a clean sheet and she wrote back one line. "The county keeps its records. I keep mine." She folded it and addressed it and set it with the outgoing mail, and she did not think on it again. There was no cruelty left in her toward that woman, and no room either, some accounts. Once the county has settled them, stay settled. She went back out to the pens. The sun was full up now over the eastern ridge, warming the frost off the rails, and the creek ran on, and Tom had the next calf hazed into the chute, and Mrs. Boone was calling that the biscuits would go hard if a body didn't come eat them. Della hung her father's iron back on its nail by the fire, warm now, used, doing the work it was cast for. Paper burns, she thought. But the truth keeps its own copy, in a man's own hand, in a county's iron safe, in a brand set clean on a spring calf by the daughter he trusted enough to write it down for. She picked up the next iron, and she got back to work. "Tell me the town you're riding in from,"